I think this ties very well into the next point that we wanted to talk about, which is the whole idea of Doikayt. Doikayt is a little bit different than diasporism, though if we're talking about diaspora Jews, the idea of connecting to wherever we live, that's our homeland. Dort wo wir leben, dort ist unser Land, as the old slogan goes.
That's it.
I always butcher that when I speak on
Hey,
on
no,
the
look, I
podcast.
got it, so that's what matters. Where we are,
But
there's our homeland.
yeah, ich bin nur ein Anheber, is what I have to say to that. There's this tension that I think you can feel a little bit in the history of the Bund. And we don't want to talk so much about the history of the Bund today, because some of the basics, I believe that a lot of the people that listen to our podcast will already know. And if they don't, then there's resources that we will add in the description of the podcast, both here and on YouTube. And we will also link to the Trave podcast that has a 3-part series about speaking about the history of the Bund. But one thing, as also a historian, as someone who is not looking at this period currently through any academic reason, but just simply out of interest, is that very early on in the history of the Bund, after 1897, there was a decision that was made that the true feeling of Doikayt would be achieved in what was then the Russian Empire, so various areas of Eastern Europe, that was Doikayt. And that if there were people that left, for example, Bundists that were scattered abroad in Switzerland or the United Kingdom as exiles or as Jewish workers in the United States, that yes, they were able to sympathize with the Bund, but they were not able to recreate themselves as local Bundist organizations for a long time, because the real struggle was to take place in what was the Russian Empire, and then later on when the Bund was only legal and able to function primarily in Poland, with some small exceptions, that was the case. And so, in my opinion, that's not exactly Doikayt. It's what later would come across as to be understood as Dortenkayt, there-ness, that true Jewish culture and communal fulfillment can take place in the diaspora, but it prioritizes a certain area because that is considered the original place of shtetl life, original place where the most Jews were concentrated. And after the Holocaust happened and the communities in these countries were much, much smaller, and a lot of the survivors just wanted to leave, and those who did want to recreate the Bund, like in Poland after the Second World War, were very quickly shut down by the communist authorities. There was a shift towards internationalizing the Jewish Labor Bund, as David Sluky looks at in his writings. But at that point, it was a little bit too late, because the strength of the Zionist movement, or different Zionist movements, and the establishment of the State of Israel was too strong for the Bund internationally to be a strong movement in the Jewish diaspora. So it's very clear that as a Bundist organization about as far away from Eastern Europe as you can get, to be able to strongly embrace the idea of Doikayt, you cannot simply view yourself as an extension of a real homeland. At this point, your homeland has become Australia, the place where you want to create your diasporism. How do you understand that tension in the current activities of the Bund in Melbourne?
I think, look, it's an interesting tension. It's an interesting concept that you mentioned. I think it's really important to, definitely keep in mind that 1897 Tsarist Russia, the social, political, economic, everything conditions there, very different to our 2023 Melbourne. I think for us, really, it is a focus on building our community right here, right now. The idea that all Jews should be building strong Jewish communities wherever they live, not necessarily looking to move to, Israel and focus their efforts there, but to really realize that where they live, that's a Jewish community. And Doikayt really focuses on the idea that all Jewish communities are equal, that Melbourne's just as important as Moscow, just as important as New York, just as important as Jerusalem. No one community is above another. I think Doikayt is not just about the ability to build a strong Jewish community, but about your right to build a strong Jewish community. I think probably, if I was back in the early 1900s, I might disagree with some of the Bundists saying that, no, we must focus on, if you're in New York, that's theirness, that's not our one. I personally think many of the Bundesländer now would disagree with it, that we should be building our communities now as we are, without a view into the future of, when we make Aliyah, that's when we'll be building our community, and that's when we'll be a Jewish community. The Jewish community is where you are right now.
And speaking of where you are right now, the idea of Doikayt as concentrating on wherever you are, that's where your community should be.
Mm.
It does not address perhaps colonial or different kinds of relations between the populations that might exist in that homeland. It doesn't state that the homeland is exclusive or the place where your community is exclusive, but it does not address these kinds of relations that would exist. And certainly in the case of either the United States or perhaps Argentina, where there is a strong Jewish community and there was a significant Bundist movement, as well as in Australia, these settler colonial relations certainly did exist. So, how do you believe that you have a strong belief that Jewish life in Australia can exist, whilst also recognizing that the land relations in Australia are significantly shaped by the injustice that happened to the native population?
Yeah. So I think a real core understanding of Doikayt is that Jewish future is interlinked with all of humanity's future, that Jews cannot be free to live their lives to the fullest in the freedom that is enabled to them without all of humanity having the chance to do that. And I think that's why really the struggle for First Nations justice is very much intertwined with our idea of Doikayt and, to some point, Havishap as well. Australian history really begins 65,000 years ago with our First Nations people, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australia for what we call today. The fact that they had hundreds of different language groups, hundreds of different communal structures is something that really the modern Australian state does ignore. And I think the uncomfortable reality for all people living in Australia, not just say the Jewish community, but is that we are living on this occupied land that was stolen. There has never been a treaty, and current process to establish a treaty met with a lot of resistance. There's this interesting kind of dichotomy in the Jewish Zionist community where Jews are native to this land of Israel and we deserve everything there is there. However, First Nations people, we can ignore their demands and ignore everything that they call for because, hey, we won, we colonized the area. Bund, very much, we believe that is not the case. And as you alluded to earlier, there is now a proposal for an Indigenous voice to government. It's called the Voice to Parliament. And the idea is to give Indigenous communities a route to help inform policy and legal decisions that impact their lives. It's currently, I guess, the hot topic issue in Australia, and the Bund is getting active in advocating for that voice to Parliament.
And even in some of the publications that you have, which we haven't mentioned yet, about Link, which we've published our dispatches from UJS conference, but even that states that you are from Melbourne, Naarm, which is the Indigenous name for the location for the colonization.
The Kulin Nations language group for what the area that the city occupies. Definitely, I think all organizations in Australia could be doing more for Indigenous groups and Indigenous justice. I think, I hope that this, the Voice to Parliament is a step, not a destination, not just for the Bund, but for the Australian community as a whole moving forward to enact a Shana Betzer belt, a more beautiful, more just world for us all to live.
I love that.